Jane Kolodinsky, and I'm the Seafair Program Chair. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. It's Seafair's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Before we get started today, I want to provide some background. Many forces are at work that are impacting supply chains for agricultural products, from climate change and wildfires and shifting consumer preferences for low and no alcohol options to uncertainties presented by tariffs. Producers and sellers of wine and spirits are facing new pressures and adapting to change. Add in global trade uncertainties, and the picture becomes even more complicated. Today, our expert panel will dive into how these dynamics impact supply chain decisions across the industry, from small craft producers to large distributors, and what it means for restaurants, bars, and consumers. Seafair has assembled a panel of experts to discuss their work, starting with Tyler Mark. Tyler is a professor of production economics in the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Kentucky. His applied research interests include hemp economics, specialty crop production costs, precision agriculture, whiskey production costs, and renewable energy. His current projects include the economic impact of hemp production, hemp cost of production, dairy policies, and factors that impact the profitability of Kentucky farmers, a state labeling of whiskey, and the impact of wind and solar installations on land values and use. Bradley Rickert is a professor of food and agricultural economics in the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. Bradley has published widely in the area of food and agricultural economics with a specific interest in addressing contemporary marketing and policy issues in specialty crop markets. Ricky Volpe received his PhD in agriculture and resource economics from UC Davis in 2010. He then spent 4 years working as an economist at the USDA Economic Research Service in Washington, D.C. Now at Cal Poly, Ricky teaches courses on food retail and supply chain management, transportation and logistics, and data analysis. Before we start our actual webinar, I want to make sure you know how to ask questions to make sure that you, the audience, knows how to engage with us. During the webinar, you can put questions to one or all of the speakers by typing them into the box in the control display accessed by clicking on the question drop-down, as shown on this slide, and sending it to the organizer. Sounds complicated, but it's really not that complicated. Now I'll start our webinar and I'll hand it over to Tyler, who's going to start us off. Welcome, Tyler.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for the opportunity to speak again today on a very important industry within the state of Kentucky that I have the opportunity to work with more and more these days. So we're going to talk a little bit about the whiskey industry, specifically bourbon, and some of the things that are going on within that space. So next slide. So if you were to go back and look at this industry, it's been growing quite rapidly, especially in the number of craft distillers, those really small distilleries that have been around. And part of that, it was a result of in 2017, the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Act, which really lowered the excise taxes for the small producers. So that started a pretty big boom. We got another pretty big boost to that in 2021 when Europe suspended its tariffs on bourbon as well. So about a 60% bump in that time as well. So you see that in that graphic where you see in 21 and 22 that really start to jump up. But what I want to get across today is that times are a little different in this industry relative to the 2018-2020 timeframe when we had the first round of tariffs that came through. During that time frame, the industry was really growing. Distilleries, the number of distilleries was growing. The distilleries were expanding production. So there was a whole lot of growth going on in that industry. And kind of today, as we look at this, growth is kind of flattened out. And you really can't tell it here yet in this, but in 2025, we've seen growth going to kind of flatten out. We've seen some distilleries actually go bankrupt, and some market access really be kind of closed off for some of those distilleries. And that's a huge portion. I mean, if you look at the graphic on the right in terms of exports in 2023, we had our best year ever with about $2.2 billion in spirits exports, and whiskey made up the largest portion of that. So that's been a point of that we've been looking at here in the state of Kentucky, and trying to get our hands wrapped around what long-term impacts this might have. Next slide, please. So if you look just at the four-state region of Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, and Tennessee, they make up a fairly large portion. Kentucky and Tennessee make up about 70% of all the whiskey produced in the U.S. A couple of other big states would be Texas, New York, and a couple of others have a number of distilleries as well. And specifically, if you look just at the state of Kentucky on the left-hand side, well, you can see it for all four states, but on the state of Kentucky, on the left-hand side table, you can see the demand basically for bushels of grain. Now, this assumes that all the grain, how much grain would be needed if all of it remained in state, right? So this wouldn't account for trade flows from one state to another, which we know there are grain that moves from one state to another to distilleries. But just to kind of give you a ballpark idea, so Kentucky needs to satisfy the bourbon industry itself needs about 77 billion bushels per year, or million bushels per year, to satisfy the distillery demand within the state of Kentucky. Wheat, much smaller. Rye is fairly large. Barley is fairly large as well. The interesting two parts about that is rye and barley. We don't really have very much production in this part of the U.S. In those two crops. So those are coming from the Midwest, and we've actually got a lot of imports that come in from other countries like England and a few others, where we get a lot of barley from, or malted barley to go with our bourbons. So those are some things that we're thinking about. On the right-hand side, you can see kind of the spatial display of all the distilleries within these four-state regions. If you look specifically at Kentucky, you're going to see some of those red blocks, and those are the macro or the really large commercial distilleries. So if you were to think about that, that would be your Heaven Hills, your Jim Beams, your Maker's Mark, those massive distilleries, and they're quite concentrated in those spaces. So what we see, and now you can go to the next graphic and really kind of what's playing out here when we start to think about this in terms of what is imported and what is exported. For the state of Kentucky, which I'm going to talk about specifically here, if you look at corn, which is on the bottom side of this, very little bit of our corn for the state of Kentucky goes into the export market. So the tariffs aren't as big of a problem for some of that. However, remember back to the slide I was talking about first when I started talking about the situation is different now versus what it was in the 2018 to 2020 timeframe. In that the distilleries aren't growing, so now we've got that demand that's kind of flattened off to some degree, even probably falling. So that's going to put some downward pressure on corn prices here in the state of Kentucky. And this is premium corn. Typically, a lot of these distilleries like to have non-GMO, potentially number one yellow corn, so it's got some other harvest components that have to go along with it. And also keep in mind too, the distillery industry for a bourbon is 4 years, so it's a pretty long process in that as well. So if they're slowing down demand, they've got all these barrels in storage, so it's going to take time to work all this through the system. For the other two crops, wheat and soybeans, which are two other large crops in the state of Kentucky, we see a huge export demand for those. So we've got this mix of impacts that are going on within the state that's going to have producers really having to think about what they are going to do going forward, and the crop mix that they're going to utilize, and the prices that they may be able to receive as some of the distilling industry potentially contracts and is not expanding as rapidly as it was. So these are some issues that myself and Grant Gardner are working on here at the University of Kentucky. I'll be more than happy to talk more about what we're doing here. We've also started to look into other ways to differentiate our bourbon. So if you have done anything on terroir, so terroir is very familiar in the wine industry, we're starting into that as well in the bourbon industry to look at ways to continue to maintain demand for premium type bourbons and whiskeys. So there will be more to come on that as well. So looking forward to questions, and Jane, back to you. You're on mute, Jane.
Thank you, Tyler, for that presentation. And talking about terroir, that was a great lead-in into our next presentation from Bradley. Bradley, welcome to talk about the wine industry.
Okay, thank you, Jane, for the introduction, for inviting me. And I'm going to sort of shift gears and focus more specifically on the wine industry, but I'm hoping that some things will apply to other sectors in the alcoholic beverage industry. So next slide, please. I thought a good place to start would be just to remind myself about a regulation, which in and of itself is a challenge for the alcoholic beverage industry, in that dating back to the end of Prohibition, there's a 3-tier distribution system or a 3-tier supply chain where alcoholic beverages need to move through each of these tiers. The first tier being producers of beer, wine, and spirits if they're produced domestically, or the importers are that first tier for imported products. And then the second tier is distributors, the third tier is retailers. And I just put this slide up here because when tariffs are applied in this to alcoholic beverages, to wine, it's the importer, it's that first tier where the tariff is levied. So they essentially are the ones paying for the tariff. And then it becomes complicated how they then pass along or share the burden of this tariff. You can see in this chart that once the tariff is applied to the importer, they are most likely going to pass along part of that burden to the distributor, to the retailer, and to the final consumers. It's also possible that the importer will negotiate to share the burden of the tariff with the wine or spirit producer in the exporting country as well. I also, when we're talking about tariffs, I also wanted to highlight that tariffs, recent tariffs apply to beer, to wine, to spirits, to the products, which raises prices in the United States and could be good for producers of those products in the United States. But those tariffs also apply to all the inputs that are used by the folks in the United States that are making wine and beer and spirits. You know, it applies to the glass, to aluminum, it applies to machinery and to all the equipment that's used in these businesses. And so I just want to highlight that. I also want to highlight that historically tariffs in alcoholic beverages are volumetric. They are so many dollars per gallon of alcoholic beverage. That penalizes, or that's harder on lower cost products that are imported into the United States. And the most recent tariffs are ad valorem tariffs that are applied as a percentage of the price, which are, you know, now penalize higher priced items coming into the United States. Next slide, please. This is another challenge or perhaps an opportunity within the United States. We have seen several states introduce specific alcoholic beverages into food retailers. So we've seen this in Washington State introducing spirits. We've seen this in Tennessee, Oklahoma, Colorado, Kansas, before that Pennsylvania. where they've introduced, and this has been a challenge. This is really disruptive to that supply chain, but it also presents some opportunities to have wine be presented in front of more people. There may be a convenience factor that may help wine sales, and this is a debate that currently is also being considered. There's legislative proposals in New York State and Maryland and Connecticut. And I think it is an important challenge, perhaps an opportunity in the wine industry. Next slide, please. This picture highlights that wine grapes, and I would argue wine grapes are particularly susceptible to extreme weather events. Here we show some sun-burnt, some sun-baked wine grapes that have, experienced too many days of too much heat, and they're not going to be very valuable for making grapes. And I think I highlight that extreme weather events are particularly hard on wine grapes because wine consumers are very interested in which varietals are in the bottle, and they're very interested in where the wine comes from, where the region where the wine grapes were produced. And so this makes it particularly hard on wine grape growers and wineries because they have less tools to adapt. They can't just simply grow a more heat tolerant varietal because consumers might not accept that. They can't just move to a cooler region because consumers might have a preference for places that historically grow wine grapes. So I think this is a real challenge for wine grape growers in the United States, but certainly around the world. And it's because consumers have these very sticky preferences for varietals and regions. Next slide, please, Lisa. This slide just serves as a way to remind me that there's some larger societal trends and events that are shaping the demand for alcohol in the United States. We certainly see less wine consumption among young people, partly because they're drinking less alcohol overall. There's maybe a shift towards the ready-to-drink alcoholic beverages. But this picture really caught my attention from an article recently published in Choices magazine, and it shows patients that are using weight loss, GLP-1 meds. It shows of this sample of 505 individuals where the demand, where food and beverage consumption is being curbed. And you can see in particular, patients using these meds, we're seeing a pretty substantial decline in their alcohol intake. And so I would view this as another challenge that's facing the alcoholic beverage industry. And I think this doesn't show the details here, but I think this is particularly a challenge for the wine industry. And I think I'll turn it back to Jane.
Thank you, Bradley, for that very interesting presentation. We have questions coming in. I'd like to remind you to present those questions in the drop-down menu if you have any. Next, we're going to turn to the consumption side of things, talking about eating and drinking places, and we're going to hear from Ricky Volpe. Welcome, Ricky.
Hi, yes, thank you. Hope you all can hear me okay, and thank you for having me. I think everyone's already realizing that there's kind of a lot of ground to cover, and Tyler and Brad both did a good job of sort of giving food for thought on spirits and wine. And I'm going to do the same, sort of trying to wrap everything up, looking at the end of the supply chain and looking specifically at some potential sort of implications of these challenges for the food service industry in particular. There's a lot of ways that we can look at this, but that's where I'm looking at this today, just sort of thinking about how ongoing challenges and the proposed implemented tariffs could affect that huge industry that employs so many people and generates so much tax revenue and all that. So on this slide right here, sort of building on the challenges Tyler talked about, and then that was great that Brad kind of wrapped up. I didn't know that about the Ozempic users and their alcohol decreases, but this right here is really sort of 30,000 feet in the air, looking at what's happening at retail alcohol sales. So to be clear, even though I'm sort of going to be pivoting and talking about food service and restaurants, this is the absolute aggregation. This is retail, total retail alcohol sales over time in the US. And you can see there's that bump that happened right around COVID, which I think most of us are sort of vaguely aware about, whether through research or our own experiences. And you can see that bump didn't go away. We're still, as a nation, we're more or less at an elevated level of consumption than we were pre-COVID. But what I think is really important is that rate of growth has slowed. And I put in a couple of best fit lines just to show that. And you can see I probably should have extrapolated that red slope, but all the way so you can see, but we've probably already reached the point where if alcohol consumption had continued to sort of grow and keep pace at its pre-COVID levels, we would very likely be at a higher level now if that rate hadn't changed, if Americans hadn't sort of slowed down in their alcohol purchase and consumption. Brad touched on sort of the role of weight loss and Ozempic, and that was really interesting. But another factor, which is related, is that sort of our sort of scientific understanding of alcohol has kind of changed. I remember when I started teaching 10, 11 years ago, I remember there was this general, I was a part of this, I've contributed to the research. There was this sort of idea that, well, maybe alcohol has some health beneficial properties when consumed in moderation. And to my understanding, that's sort of more or less been shut down. And there's this general understanding that maybe alcohol consumption doesn't have any real viable health benefits at any level. And I'm not saying that's settled, but that seems to be the current vibe. And that does seem to be resonating with Americans. I think we can see that in the sort of decreased growth that's almost surely not keeping pace with either population growth or inflation. So this sets the stage for, as Tyler and Brad have talked about, what's already kind of a challenging time for wine, spirits, and alcohol in general. Next slide, please. So again, and I apologize, I forgot to put my source on here, but this comes directly from the USDA Economic Research Food Environment Atlas. It's a great county level and state level publicly available data set. Use it all the time in my teaching and research. But I thought that this was just one of the many ways that we could sort of look at the potential implications of these challenges and of these proposed and implemented tariffs in particular. So what we have here is, this is the bottom 10 US states in terms of full service restaurants per capita. So this does not include quick service, all takeaway, fast food, your McDonald's and all that kind of stuff. This is sit down restaurants. And just as, so again, for food for thought, you can see that I've highlighted the bottom two are Utah and Maryland. And what those two states have in common is that if you look at data from the National Restaurant Association or from other sources, from the Wine Institute or wherever you may look, these two states consistently rank at the bottom among all 50 in terms of alcohol consumption per capita. Now, I have not gone ahead and calculated the correlation between total availability or density of restaurants and alcohol consumption across US states. Be a fun exercise. But I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that the states that we find at the very bottom also stand out in terms of relatively low alcohol consumption. And I think that's because alcohol purchases are such an important part of sort of the economic and the profitability picture for restaurants. Next slide, please. So building on that, just some implications and thoughts. What we know is that alcohol sales are very, very important to food service, to restaurants, especially sit-down restaurants. Estimates vary, but the National Restaurant Association says they're about 21% of revenues. But importantly, because the margins for alcohol are so high, we don't have the labor costs, we don't have anywhere near the prep time or the cleanup or any of that extent. The margins are higher, so the share of profits is even higher. I've even seen some estimates saying that for a lot of restaurants, alcohol accounts for about half of overall profits. And that kind of, in my view, helps to explain why there's a lower restaurant density in states with less demand or affinity towards alcohol. So I did a really quick, kind of simple back of the envelope calculation. It makes a bunch of assumptions. And because of that, I give a range. But these sort of proposed tariffs that are put in place that have the potential to, you know, increase wine, spirits, you name it, if they have the intention to increase those prices on the order of 10, 25, 50%, you name it, well, we can take those numbers. We can take these sort of proposed or implemented tariffs and understand what's going to happen to tequila from Mexico or wine from France or whiskey from Canada. And we have these estimates of the demand elasticity, or the extent to which on-premise consumers respond to price increases, and we can back out what might be sort of the total impact on restaurant sales as a result of the tariffs as they're currently being discussed and implemented and talked about. And these are pretty big numbers. You know, this is a pretty big slice of the pie. We're looking at potential impacts on the order of between 17 and $43 billion on the Restaurant Association. And I don't claim to say that either of those numbers are going to be exactly right or that we've handed, because again, there's a lot of moving pieces, and this doesn't even talk on, there's a case to be made that we're underestimating, because, for example, Brad made a good point of saying, well, it's not just what happens to the wine, it's the aluminum cans and the bottles and so on and so forth, all these sort of behind the scenes supply chain issues that are already being affected by tariffs around the world coming from China and other places like that. So if you remember nothing from this, just that it's very plausible that the impact on total revenues and profitability for sit-down restaurants will probably be pretty high, in the tens of billions, and that of course has implications for wages and tips and tax revenues and so on and so forth. All right, next slide please, and I'll wrap up. So just a few more things to think about, again, in the spirit of saying that this is coming at a particularly challenging time, not just for wine and spirits, but in general for food service and for retail. It's worth pointing out that we know that largely because of the sort of inflationary boom that we faced in the US and around the world during and a couple of years after COVID, we know shopper sentiment is down. In general, you know, you look at any survey from FMI, NGA, you name it, sentiment is down, consumers are generally not happy, price sensitivity is up. So that means that responsiveness to price increases is up. And I'll just sort of move down here and just give some considerations, because all these final bullet points here are drawn from the research that we have, that we've been able to sort of study in the wake of the first round of tariffs in the first Trump administration, in terms of how firms, multi-product firms such as food retailers and food service providers, respond to tariffs. And it's just worth understanding that one might think, oh, okay, well, let's talk about wine. If the tariffs affect wine coming from France and Italy, then maybe restaurants can shift to California wine, and that would be a boon for the California wine industry. And that's not entirely wrong, but given that food service providers operate on relatively thin margins, they are probably going to respond by sort of averaging out these tariff impacts across their products, including on domestic prices, to avoid dramatic price surges for those wines or spirits or what have you directly affected by the tariffs. And then in the interest of cutting costs to sort of stay in the black and stay profitability, it's very likely that we will see these firms and these chains respond by cutting operating hours, layoffs, reducing labor force wherever possible, and investing in automation, cutting product offerings, and cutting promotions, which can be effective for getting people in the door, but further cut those margins. So there's a lot of sort of indirect effects that we saw last time during a round of sort of less expansive and less sweeping tariffs that we can expect to see in food service and retail this time around if these tariffs stay in place. Those are my slides. Thank you for listening. I'll be happy to take any questions.